The morning mist clung to Brooklyn Heights like a shroud, obscuring the movements of 10,000 Continental soldiers, who had no idea their doom was already sealed. General George Washington stood at his headquarters, peering through a spyglass at the largest armada ever assembled in American waters for 100 British ships, stretching across New York Harbor like a forest of masts. The sight should have terrified him, but Washington's jaw remained set in grim determination. Across the water, General William Howe surveyed his prize from the deck of HMS Eagle. 32,000 British and Hessian troops crowded the decks of transports, the largest expeditionary force the Crown had ever assembled. This was no mere putative expedition, this was conquest incarnate. Howe's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Crush the rebellion's heart by capturing New York, divide the colonies, and end this costly war before winter. The American position seemed formidable at first glance. Washington had transformed Brooklyn Heights into a fortress, with earthworks and redoubts commanding the approaches from the harbor. But beneath this impressive facade lay fatal weaknesses that would soon be exploited with surgical precision. The Continental Army was spread thin across a 4-mile front, with inexperienced militia holding crucial positions alongside battle-tested regulars. General Israel Putnam, the grizzled veteran commanding the American left wing, had positioned his Connecticut troops along the Gowanus Heights, a series of wooded ridges that formed Brooklyn's natural defense line. These heights, rising 60 to 80 feet above the surrounding countryside, offered commanding views of all approaches from the south and east. But Putnam had made a crucial error. He had left the Jamaica Pass, the easternmost route through the heights, virtually unguarded. As dawn broke on August 22nd, the British began their landing at Gravesend Bay. The sight was magnificent, and terrifying regiment after regiment of redcoats, splashing ashore in perfect formation, their brass buttons gleaming in the morning sun. The Hessian Jugers, feared throughout Europe for their marksmanship, followed close behind, their green uniforms a stark contrast to British scarlet. According to historical accounts from the New York Historical Society, the American scouts who witnessed this landing reported varying numbers to their commanders, creating confusion about British strength and intentions. Some estimated 15,000 troops, others claimed 20,000, but all agreed on one thing: this was no mere raid. Washington rushed reinforcements across the East River throughout the day, ferrying regiment after regiment from Manhattan to Brooklyn. By evening, he had committed nearly half his army to defending Long Island, a decision that would prove both desperate and prescient. The stage was set for the largest battle of the Revolutionary War, though neither side yet understood the full magnitude of what was about to unfold. The British spent 3 days consolidating their beachhead, bringing ashore artillery, supplies, and cavalry. Howe was in no hurry. He had learned from Bunker Hill that frontal assaults against prepared positions were costly. This time, he would use guile instead of gore, maneuver instead of muscle. The trap was being set with methodical precision. The sound of axes biting into wood echoed across the Flatbush plain as British engineers began constructing what appeared to be siege works, facing the American center. To Washington's observers on Brooklyn Heights, the enemy's intention seemed clear: a frontal assault against the strongest part of their line. It was exactly what Howe wanted them to think. While the main British force made an elaborate show of preparing for a direct attack, a more subtle drama was unfolding in the command tents. Howe had summoned his most trusted generals, Henry Clinton, Lord Cornwallis, and Earl Percy, to finalize a plan of breathtaking audacity. They would divide their force into 3 columns, with the center and left making diversionary attacks, while the main force executed a flanking maneuver that would make military history. The key to this strategy lay in intelligence gathered from local loyalists who knew every path and farm road on Long Island. Captain William Erskine of the Dragoons had spent weeks mapping the terrain, paying particular attention to the Jamaica Pass and narrow defile through the heights that the Americans had left defended by only 5 officers and 30 men. This oversight would prove catastrophic. General John Sullivan commanded the American right wing. Positioned along the Bedford Pass, his New Hampshire troops were seasoned fighters, but they faced an impossible task, defending a 2-mile front with barely 3,000 men. Sullivan had begged Washington for reinforcements, but the commander-in-chief was convinced the main British attack would come against the center. Lord Stirling, born William Alexander, but claiming a Scottish peerage, held the American left with his Delaware and Maryland regiments. These were among the finest troops in the Continental Army. Drilled to European standards and equipped with proper uniforms, Sterling's men occupied the strategic Gowanus Heights, controlling the main road to Brooklyn Ferry. They would bear the brunt of the coming storm. The weather turned oppressive on August 25th. With thick humidity that made woolen uniforms cling to sweating bodies, British patrols probed the American lines throughout the day, exchanging musket fire with Continental pickets. These skirmishes seemed routine to the Americans, merely the enemy testing their defenses. In reality, they were carefully orchestrated reconnaissance missions designed to map every weakness in the American position. As chronicled in David McCullough's 1776, British officers spent the evening of August 25th studying detailed maps provided by local guides who had lived on Long Island their entire lives. These loyalist farmers knew every cowpath and creek crossing, knowledge that would prove invaluable in the coming battle. Captain Nathan Hale, serving with Knowlton's Rangers, reported seeing unusual British activity near the Jamaica Pass during a nighttime reconnaissance mission. His warnings reached Washington's headquarters, but the intelligence was dismissed as enemy deception. The Americans could not conceive that Howe would risk dividing his force in enemy territory, a failure of imagination that would cost them dearly. At midnight, the final preparations began. British quartermasters distributed extra ammunition and rations, while regimental surgeons sharpened their instruments and prepared their field hospitals. The die was cast, though dawn would bring hours of maneuvering before the killing began. Howe's masterpiece was about to unfold, and the Americans remained blissfully unaware of their peril. At 2 o'clock in the morning, 10,000 British troops began their silent march through the darkness. General Henry Clinton led this massive, flanking column eastward along country roads, their equipment muffled with cloth to prevent noise. Behind them stretched a line of soldiers that seemed endless: light infantry, grenadiers, Royal Marines, and Hessian Jugers, all moving with the ghostly precision of a well-oiled war machine. The main column's route took them through flatlands, then north toward Bedford, staying well east of American outposts. Local loyalist guides led each regiment, men who had hunted these woods as boys and knew every hidden trail. The British moved like shadows through the pre-dawn darkness, covering 9 miles in absolute silence, a testament to their discipline and training. Meanwhile, the diversionary attacks began with theatrical precision. At Flatbush Pass, General James Grant led 5,000 troops in a noisy advance against Sullivan's New Hampshire men. Drums rolled, fifes shrilled, and Highland pipes wailed as the Scots advanced in full regalia. The sound echoed off the hills, creating the impression of a massive assault. Sullivan's men took their positions behind stone walls and earthworks, muskets loaded and bayonets fixed. The British attack seemed exactly what they had expected: a frontal assault by an overconfident enemy. They could see the glint of steel in the growing light, hear the officers shouting commands in clipped English accents. Everything appeared normal, which was precisely the point. At the Martin's Lane Pass, Lord Cornwallis launched a similar diversionary attack with 2,000 men. His guards' regiments advanced with parade ground precision, their scarlet uniforms brilliant in the morning sun. American defenders rushed to meet this threat, convinced they were witnessing the main British effort. The sound of musketry crackled across the heights as skirmishers exchanged fire, but the real drama was unfolding miles to the east, where Clinton's massive column approached the Jamaica Pass. The American outpost that consisted of Captain Samuel Chester and 30 men from Sullivan's brigade, a pitifully inadequate force to guard such a crucial position. They had built a small redoubt and felt secure in their assignment, believing the British would never attempt such a wide flanking movement. At dawn, the lead elements of Clinton's column struck like lightning. Captain Chester's men barely had time to fire a volley before being overwhelmed by hundreds of light infantrymen. A few Americans escaped to carry word of the disaster, but the damage was done. The Jamaica Pass was in British hands, and the door to Brooklyn Heights stood wide open. As reported in correspondence preserved by the Library of Congress, Washington received the first confused reports of disaster around 7 o'clock that morning, but the full magnitude of the catastrophe remained unclear for precious hours. Clinton's troops now poured through the pass like water through a broken dam. Regiment after regiment emerged from the defile, wheeling westward to take the American defenders in the rear. The trap that had been months in the planning was finally springing closed, and there was nothing Washington could do to stop it. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the mist that had concealed British movements. Across the heights, American soldiers began to hear an ominous sound from their rear, the steady tramp of marching feet and the harsh commands of British officers. The unthinkable was happening. They were being surrounded. The first indication of disaster came to General Sullivan when one of his aides galloped up, horse lathered with sweat and eyes wide with terror. "Sir, British troops in our rear, thousands of them." The aide's voice cracked as he delivered the impossible news that would seal the fate of the American right wing. Sullivan spun his spyglass eastward and felt his blood turn to ice. A solid wall of scarlet uniforms was advancing from the Jamaica Pass, their bayonets glittering like a field of deadly wheat. Behind them came more regiments, and more still, an endless tide of professional soldiers moving with mechanical precision. The British had achieved complete surprise, and Sullivan's 3,000 men were about to be crushed between hammer and anvil. "Form square. Prepare to receive cavalry," Sullivan shouted. But his orders were lost in the growing chaos. His new Hampshire men had been facing south toward Grant's diversionary attack. Now they had to wheel about and face an entirely new threat from the east. The complexity of this maneuver, attempted under fire by militia troops, was a recipe for disaster. Clinton's advance guard struck 1st Light Infantry companies moving at the double quick, their officers urging them forward with drawn swords. These were elite troops, handpicked for their speed and aggression. They slammed into Sullivan's hastily formed line like a thunderbolt, and the American position began to crumble almost immediately. The sound of the British attack was terrifying in its precision. The synchronized crash of volleys, the mechanical rhythm of reloading, the inhuman discipline of men trained to kill without hesitation. Against this professional war machine, Sullivan's farmers and tradesmen fought with desperate courage. But courage alone could not overcome such overwhelming disadvantage. From his position on the Gowanus Heights, Lord Stirling watched the destruction of the American right with growing horror. His own Maryland and Delaware troops were still engaged with Cornwallis's diversionary attack, but it was becoming clear that this was no longer the main threat. The real battle was now raging behind them, where Sullivan's men were being systematically destroyed. Stirling faced an agonizing choice: maintain his position and risk being cut off, or retreat while escape was still possible. Military wisdom dictated immediate withdrawal, but abandoning Sullivan to his fate went against every instinct of the 46-year-old Scotsman, who had spent years preparing for this moment. The decision was made for him when British cannon began firing from the Jamaica Pass. Clinton had brought up his artillery with remarkable speed, and now solid shot was crashing through the American positions with devastating effect. One cannonball decapitated 3 men standing in line, spraying their comrades with blood and bone fragments. The psychological impact was as destructive as the physical damage. As documented in pension records housed at the National Archives, survivors of Sullivan's brigade described the British advance as inexorable as fate itself, with redcoats stepping over their fallen comrades without breaking stride. Sullivan himself was taken prisoner while trying to rally a final stand at the WWII house. His capture marked the complete collapse of the American right wing, though scattered groups of his men continued fighting as they retreated toward Brooklyn Heights. The morning that had begun with such hope was turning into unmitigated disaster. The British trap was now fully sprung, with American forces caught between multiple converging columns. What had started as a defensive battle was rapidly becoming a rout, and only the desperate courage of a few units prevented complete catastrophe. The fate of the revolution hung in the balance as smoke and flame consumed the Brooklyn countryside. Lord Stirling's voice carried across the battlefield like a thunderclap as he addressed his Maryland regiment. "Gentlemen, we are surrounded, but we are not defeated. Today we show these European professionals how Americans die." His words were met with a cheer that seemed impossible given their desperate circumstances. But these were men who had drilled for months under Baron von Steuben's iron discipline. The situation was beyond critical. Clinton's flanking force had swept westward from the Jamaica Pass, crushing Sullivan's brigade and now threatening to encircle Stirling's entire command. To the south, Cornwallis was pressing his attack with renewed vigor, no longer content with a mere diversion. The Americans were trapped in a narrowing pocket. With Gowanus Creek at their backs and British steel on 3 sides, Major Mordecai Gist, the 1st Maryland Regiment, deployed his 400 men along the WWII house, a stone farmhouse that commanded the main road to Brooklyn Ferry. These Marylanders were the cream of the Continental Army, young gentlemen from Baltimore and Annapolis who had equipped themselves at their own expense and trained to European standards. They would Need every ounce of that training in the next hour. The British assault came with devastating precision. The 42nd Highland Regiment, known as the Black Watch, advanced in perfect formation despite withering American musket fire. Their pipes shrieked the ancient war songs of Scotland. As they charged, claymores gleaming in the afternoon sun. Behind them came the Royal Marines. Their sea green uniforms darkened with powder smoke and blood. Just Marylanders met the charge, with controlled volleys that dropped dozens of Highlanders. But there were always more to take their places. The stone house became a fortress, with Americans firing from every window while British troops tried to storm the walls. The fighting was hand-to-hand now, bayonet against sword. Desperation against discipline. Colonel Samuel Smallwood led the 2nd Maryland in a countercharge that temporarily drove back the British left. But the effort was hopeless. For every redcoat that fell, Moore appeared to take his place. The mathematics of the battle were inexorable. Outnumbered 5-1, the Americans could not sustain their losses much longer. Sterling himself led the most desperate charge of the day, taking 250 men in a direct assault against Cornwallis's position. It was military madness, but it served a crucial purpose, buying time for the remnants of other regiments to escape across Gowanus Creek. The old Revolutionary War general knew he was sacrificing his men, but the alternative was the capture of Washington's entire army. The charge struck the British line like a hammer blow. Sterling's men fought with the fury of the condemned, their bayonets finding gaps in British armor, their musket butts crushing skulls for 15 minutes. 250 Americans held off 1,000 British troops through sheer audacity and desperate courage, according to battlefield reports preserved in the Maryland Historical Society. Cornwallis himself later praised the extraordinary valor displayed by Sterling's men, calling their charge as brave an action as ever was performed. But valor could not overcome arithmetic. One by one, the Marylanders fell until only a handful remained. Sterling, his uniform torn and sword broken, finally surrendered when further resistance became impossible. Of the 250 men who had followed him in that final charge, fewer than 10 would see another sunset dot behind them. Gowanus Creek ran red with American blood as the survivors attempted to cross its treacherous waters. Some drowned in the attempt, weighed down by equipment and wounds. Others were shot by British troops who had reached the opposite bank. The disaster was complete, but it had achieved its purpose. Washington's main army lived to fight another day. As darkness fell over Brooklyn Heights, George Washington stood among the earthworks surveying the wreckage of his army. The day had been an unmitigated disaster, nearly 2,000 casualties, including some of his best officers captured or killed. The cream of the Continental Army lay scattered across Long Island's bloody fields, and 30,000 British troops were tightening the noose around his remaining forces. The situation defied military logic. Washington's army was trapped on Brooklyn Heights with the East River at their backs, and no means of retreat. British warships controlled the harbor, ready to blast any boat that attempted to ferry troops to Manhattan. Howe's artillery was already being positioned for a siege that could only end one way: complete American surrender and the death of the Revolution. But Washington was not ready to concede defeat. In the commander's tent, lit by flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the canvas walls, he gathered his surviving generals for a council of war that would determine the fate of American independence. The atmosphere was grim. These men had witnessed the destruction of their comrades and knew that death or capture awaited them at dawn. General Nathanael Greene, still weak from fever but insistent on participating, studied the crude map spread across the planning table. "We cannot hold these positions against a proper siege," he stated bluntly. "Our earthworks were designed to repel a landing, not withstand concentrated artillery fire from multiple directions." Israel Putnam, his Connecticut uniform stained with mud and blood, voiced what everyone was thinking. "We need boats, sir. Enough boats to carry 9,000 men across a river mile wide. Under the guns of the Royal Navy, it's impossible." His weathered face showed the strain of the day's fighting, but his eyes still held the stubborn defiance that had carried him through the French and Indian War. Washington remained silent for long minutes, his gray eyes fixed on the map of New York Harbor. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady despite the magnitude of what he was proposing. "Gentlemen, we will evacuate the entire army to Manhattan tonight, under cover of darkness and this providential fog." The plan was audacious beyond belief. Washington proposed to move 9,000 men, their equipment, artillery, and supplies across the East River in complete silence. using whatever boats could be commandeered from the surrounding area. They would have perhaps 6 hours of darkness, with British sentries posted less than 100 yards from their positions. Colonel John Glover of Marblehead stepped forward, his weathered sailor's face grim, but determined. His Massachusetts regiment consisted entirely of fishermen and merchant sailors' men. Who knew boats like landsmen knew horses? My lads can handle the ferrying, sir. But we'll need every craft from here to Hellgate. Fishing boats, ferries, cargo barges, anything that floats. As recorded in Washington's own correspondence, housed in the Library of Congress, the decision to evacuate Brooklyn Heights was made in the face of almost certain destruction. With no alternative but to attempt the impossible, the orders went out immediately. Every regiment was to prepare for movement, but in absolute silence. No talking, no clanking of equipment, no unnecessary noise that might alert British patrols. Weapons were to be muffled, wagon wheels wrapped in cloth, even the horses' hooves bound with rags. Meanwhile, Glover's men spread out across the waterfront like phantoms, commandeering every floating vessel they could find. Fishing smacks from Brooklyn's harbors, cargo lighters from the commercial docks, even private rowboats pressed into service. The makeshift fleet began assembling at the ferry landing as fog rolled in from the harbor. A meteorological miracle that would make the evacuation possible. The race against time had begun, with the fate of American independence hanging in the balance. In a few hours, dawn would reveal whether Washington's desperate gamble had succeeded or whether the Continental Army would wake up as prisoners of the Crown. The fog that rolled in from New York Harbor was so thick a man could barely see his hand before his face. Washington stood at the Brooklyn ferry landing, watching his army dissolve into the gray mist like ghosts returning to the grave. This was either divine providence or the luckiest coincidence in military history. Without this natural screen, the evacuation would have been impossible. Colonel Glover's Marblehead men worked like demons possessed, their knowledge of boats and tides making them invaluable in this desperate hour. These weathered fishermen guided regiment after regiment to the water's edge, loading them into whatever craft was available. A company of Connecticut militia found themselves crammed into a fishing smack designed for 6 men, while Delaware troops balanced precariously in commandeered rowboats. The silence was supernatural. 9,000 men moved through the darkness without a single shout or clatter of arms. Officers passed orders in whispers, soldiers communicated through hand signals, and even the wounded bit down on leather straps to muffle their groans. The entire army had become a shadow of itself, existing more in sound than sight. Washington himself remained at the landing until the very end, personally supervising the embarkation of each unit. His tall figure was unmistakable even in the fog, and his presence steadied men who might otherwise have panicked in the confusion. When a young ensign stumbled and nearly dropped his musket into the water, Washington caught both man and weapon without a word. The most dangerous moment came when a British patrol approached the American lines just before dawn. The redcoats were close enough that the Americans could hear their conversation, discussing the unusual quiet from the rebel positions. One sergeant suggested investigating, but his officer decided it wasn't worth the risk in such thick fog. The patrol moved on, unaware that they had just saved the revolution. As the first gray light of dawn began to penetrate the mist, the last boatload of American troops pushed off from Brooklyn. Washington himself was in that final vessel, refusing to leave until every man under his command was safe. Behind them, the abandoned earthworks stood empty except for 3 damaged cannon too heavy to move, and a few camp dogs left behind in the confusion. The British discovered the evacuation at sunrise when the fog finally lifted. General Howe himself rode to the American positions, expecting to demand their surrender, only to find empty trenches and cold cooking fires. His carefully planned siege had captured nothing but abandoned ground and the bitter knowledge that his prey had escaped. The tactical implications were staggering. In one night, Washington had moved an entire army across a mile of open water, under the noses of the world's most powerful navy. No boats had been intercepted, no men lost to enemy action, no equipment of significance abandoned. It was a logistical miracle that seemed to defy the laws of physics. According to historical accounts preserved by the New York Historical Society, British officers expressed grudging admiration for the evacuation's execution, with one writing that the rebels have shown themselves capable of military operations that would credit European armies. The Battle of Long Island was over, ending in tactical defeat but strategic salvation for the American cause. The Continental Army lived to fight another day, carrying with it hard-learned lessons about British military capabilities and the deadly price of underestimating professional soldiers. Washington's army had been bloodied, but not broken, educated, but not destroyed. The heights of Brooklyn had fallen, but the idea they represented that free men could govern themselves survived to inspire future victories. In losing the battle, the Americans had won something far more valuable: time to learn, adapt, and ultimately prevail. The retreat from Long Island became the stuff of legend, proving that sometimes the greatest victories come not from standing and fighting, but from knowing when to live and fight another day. The revolution would continue, carried forward by men who had stared death in the face and refused to blink.